There we go. Um, Charlie, I'm afraid that no, the chat doesn't work like that on this one. So, yes, Edward II, he ends up losing to Scotland, let's say. He's also got pretty bad relationship going on with France. England and France, they've been, poking at each other. They've not been very good friends for a little while now. So to try and bring the two sides together, to try and make peace, Edward I had married his son, Edward II, to a princess, a French princess, Princess Isabella. And together they had brought about a kind of peace between France and England, still a bit of a fragile peace, but it doesn't seem like they particularly liked each other. We'll see more on that in a bit. So we've got this marriage, not one of the great romances of history, though. Edward and his wife do not see eye to eye. Now, Edward pretty much fails at taking down Scotland, which is bad enough, but he also then leads the country into a time of famine, which is a time when there is not enough food. People are going hungry. Some people are actually starving to death. So this is a bit of a byproduct of his wars with Scotland, which aren't going very well. So we can already see that Edward, right from day one, he's not looking particularly strong or tough, especially if you compare him to his warlord of a dad who conquered Wales. The people are hungry, the people are grumpy, and people start to whisper and plot and start to work against the king in the shadows. The shadows. Oh, happy birthday, Joshua. Right, congratulations. How old was he when he came to the throne? I'm not entirely sure. He wasn't massively young, but he also wasn't massively old. I imagine 20s, 30s. I'll look it up if I get a chance in a minute. Kyle's saying 21. Sounds about right. Yeah, okay. Now, relationships between the king and his people start to get worse, more and more sour as the years go by. And a lot of this is to do with his BFF, his best friend forever, Piers Gaveston. Now, Piers is probably, although we're not entirely sure, probably Edward's boyfriend. If not his boyfriend, then just his very best friend who he seems to want to ignore his wife for. And these two, they have a very tight bromance. It's speculated whether they were lovers or not, but it kind of doesn't matter really. What does matter is that Edward starts giving lots of extra power and lots of wealth to Piers, and instead of talking to the fledgling parliament, which is there in the background, or to the people, or to his other nobles and lords, he only ever really cares what Piers thinks, including his wife. He doesn't care what she thinks either. It's all about Piers. Now, the people, the nobles of England, they put pressure on him, and they start to, complain and moan, and they try and get rid of him. And they complain to him about Piers. They say, "You're always hanging around with Piers. You're not hanging around with us anymore. You're always giving Piers the cool stuff. We don't get anything. This is so unfair." And so Edward decides that he really has to send his friend away. He exiles his friend. He kicks him out of England, makes him go and live somewhere else. But this only lasts for a little while. Edward misses his friend too much. Oh. And so he decides he would rather fight the nobles and the barons and the people of England and keep his friend than lose his friend and have friends with the barons of England. So it becomes quite romantic in some ways. But this does not mean good things for the people of England, because this means that now there are nobles plotting and scheming and fights going on, and it's all going a bit crazy. That's a good question. So Asma is asking if Edward's crown is heavy. I imagine the crowns were heavy. I don't know exactly about Edward's. The crowns of England have changed through the years. Edward's crown would have been sold. A few kings ended up selling the crown jewels to make money. So Edward's crown certainly doesn't exist anymore, but I wouldn't know how heavy it was. Pretty heavy, I imagine. Another good question there from Queen Margaret. Who painted the portrait? And to be honest, I don't know. All I do know is that all the portraits we use in these lessons are relatively modern. They're not most of them painted at the time. They're painted afterwards. So it is hard to see how accurate they are for sure. Yeah. Good question though. Um, why would you want a heavy crown? I suppose you want to, if you're wearing a crown with as much gold as possible, it is going to be quite heavy because gold is a very heavy metal. So I suppose you'd want it to be heavy. I mean, symbolically, because that keeps the weight of the country and your responsibility. You can feel it pressing down. But more practically, it just looks really cool if it's made of gold, I guess. Um, uh, did his dad have a dad that did not like Scotland? Well, his dad didn't like Scotland, and I suppose Edward's dad, they kind of fought with Scotland too. But really, it was Edward II's dad, Edward I, who really went into war with Scotland. And we'll talk more about Scotland in a bit, actually. Let me just find out, how old was Edward when he became king? Because a few people are asking me that question. Let me find out. He was coronated. There we are. In 1308, and he was born in 1284. So that's 16 plus 8, 24 years old. There you go. Excellent. 24. So he's in his early 20s when he becomes king. So he's not like a child. There are child kings, and we'll see one in a minute. But no, he's relatively ready. He's already married by the time he becomes king. But romantic bliss is not for him, mainly because of Piers, but also possibly for other reasons too. So he brings back Piers after having sent him away, which was supposed to make the people happy. He brings Piers back because he can't stand to be without him, and then his wife gets the hump. Understandably, she's probably quite jealous because Edward's hanging around with Piers instead of her, and so she decides to go back to France. Remember, she is a French princess, and so she heads back to France, and she doesn't just sit around calmly. Oh no, she finds a lover, and the two of them build an army which they will use to come and fight her own husband. So now, from over the channel, from over in France, comes an army led by the king's wife and the king's wife's boyfriend. This is getting tricky. So fights break out. War breaks out across England again. Whenever there's a time of war, especially if it's in England, the people are not particularly happy. So people are poor, people are hungry. There's war going on here. Oh, I'm being told I'm breaking up. Let me see if I can just fix that for you people. Here we go. There we are. So we've got unhappy populace. Lots of the nobles, they side with Queen Isabella, and they essentially bring Edward down. They beat him in battle, they capture him, and they lock him away in a castle. So yes, I've written here relationship breakdown. That is some relationship breakdown. Now, there will be a few rescue attempts by followers of Edward to try and free him from prison, some of which will almost work, but none of them quite do. They always get foiled in the end. And how many King Edwards are there? Well, the latest King Edward we've had is King Edward VIII. He was the king, 2 kings before two rulers before our current queen. So yeah, there's been a lot of Edwards. When was this? So we're in 1327 now. 1326, because he dies early in 1327. But what happens is he cannot be rescued from prison, and the more that people try and rescue him, the more his wife and her boyfriend get very, very upset, and they get more and more worried. They're like, oh no, what happens if they let him out next time? So they decide that he must die. Oh dear. Now, the exact way that this guy dies, poor old Edward II, the way he dies is a bit of a mystery. There's a very common rumor about how he died, but there's little historic evidence to back it up. It could be true, but it might not be true. But I'll tell you the story that everyone hears. And that is that a group of ruffians come in the night whilst Edward is in prison, and they stab him up the bottom with a red hot poker. Eee, nasty. So, not on the toilet. No, I don't think he's on the toilet at that point. But yes, so he is killed via red hot poker up the bum. That's the story. Now, as I say, it's not really sure. Lots of people have written about this, but it seems they started writing about it, sometime after his death. So whether it's true or not, we don't know. There were some rumors at the time that he didn't die, that he did escape from prison, and he went and lived quietly like a monk, a hermit, in a cave in the Holy Roman Empire, which is Germany or northern Italy. But again, there's no evidence of that. It's more than likely that he was killed. And it may well be hot poker up the bottom, but I'm not entirely sure. I'm not sure. Rock's asking which castle that is. Let me just find out for you. I believe it's not Nottingham Castle. Berkeley Castle is where he dies. So yes, not Nottingham Castle. Kyle's asking when it's mythology. So just to remind you guys, today, Monday, is modern history. Tomorrow will be geography, and we're heading to France, which fits nicely with our history lesson today. Then on Wednesday, we are going to look at the early Roman Republic. Very posh, going to ancient Rome. And then on Friday, we're going to have a look at the Roman hero Aeneas. So there you go. That should be quite fun. Some French people in the chat. Very good. Or quarter French people. I hope you won't get too upset by the next part of this. So Edward is dead, and the crown ends up. Now, for a while there, it looks like his wife is going to take over. His wife and her boyfriend. Her boyfriend is Mortimer, but that is not going to stay the same for long. Very quickly, Ed's wife, she decides she'd rather go back to France, I guess. And she hands over the kingdom to Edward's son, my very favourite king, Edward the Third. Here we go. Oh, I haven't put his dates in properly. Look, let me just put in Ed's dates. Oh, shock horror. To 1377, I need to write in there. Here we go. To this point, our second longest reigning king. So if Edward II went for 20 years, Edward III is going for 50 years. He's a teenage king to start with. He is made king when he's just 14 years old. That's a good question, Rukia. Yes, these guys are still speaking French. So even though we're talking about kings of England, we are really talking French-speaking kings of England. Yes. Now, these kings are slightly different from the earlier Plantagenets. So take Richard the Lionheart as the best example. Only spent 6 months in England, didn't really like the place. These kings now are spending far more time in England. I mean, Edward I spent pretty much all of his time in England when he wasn't in Wales kicking that, or in Scotland. Edward II also spent a lot of his time in England. So, they're definitely settling down in England now a bit more, but they are still speaking French, and all official language is spoken in French as well. So there you go. Why do I love him so much? You will see. I'm hoping that we'll get our first 5-star king here. So he takes over the throne at a young age, and the first thing he does is a bit ruthless. If you remember, his mother, Queen Isabella, and her boyfriend, his stepfather, Edward III's stepfather, they've killed his dad. And Edward doesn't just sit around and accept this. He's not happy with his mum and his stepdad in particular. And even though he's just a teenager, he's very concerned that his stepfather, Mortimer, seems to be making a lot of decisions. He seems to be swanning around the place. He seems to think he's the king. And Edward will not have this. So as a young man, as a teenager, he declares war on his own stepfather and ends up killing him, leaving the throne clear for himself. So he's a very active young man, He's not letting his mum's boyfriend stand in the way. Oh no. He stamps his authority, and he makes sure that he is king by himself, with no one to bother him in the background. Now, whereas his father, Edward II, had a romance with Piers Gaveston, Edward III will have his own romance, but this time with his queen Philippa. So he will marry Philippa at quite a young age. I'm not sure exactly what the age is. And they will stay madly, truly, deeply in love, as far as we can tell, for their entire lives. Edward will later get a girlfriend, but not until his wife is dead. So there you go. They seem to stay true to each other their entire lives, which is very nice. So you've got Edward and Philippa, this dream team, they work together, and Edward's pretty good at working together. Now, if we remember, if we go back a couple of weeks to King John, bad King John. King John is famous for not letting anyone else have any power. Yeah, he fights against his own barons. He won't let the people decide on things. So he doesn't get on well with others, and most of the Plantagenet kings don't, to be fair. They like to do things on their own. Edward is a little bit different than this. And I'm not going to go completely crazy and say he's like our modern queen who lets the parliament do everything, but he does give parliament quite a lot more power than they're used to. Okay, there's still nothing like today, but he makes it traditional. He listens to his parliament. The parliament are the people that the group of, at this point they're not elected, but they are groups of rich people who the king will have to gather around, and they'll be able to make laws, or at least suggest laws. They'll be able to raise taxes themselves sometimes. And it's down to Edward that they start really getting the power they did. John, he has to sign the Magna Carta, which gives the people a bit of power, but he ignores it and basically rips it up, so to speak. Edward I, Edward II, they just sort of antagonize their people quite a lot, whereas Edward is all about bringing people together. So he gives Parliament more power, and he really loves knights. The idea of chivalry, which is, this is where the idea of a true knight comes in, probably with Edward III. He believes that knights, who are the rich people, the soldiers, if you like, the people with their own horses and armor and things, he believes that they should be good people, not just, like they were in the time of William I. The knights were just people who would come around and smack your head in and steal your money. No, he wants knights to be true and bold and wonderful. He very much loves the legends of King Arthur, and he wants to have his own round table, and he wants to fill it with knights. So he never quite gets his round table, not exactly, but he comes up with something called the Order of the Garter, which is a special sort of, I suppose we could call it a knight club, a club where all the knights come together. Now, our queen today, here's a very modern photograph, our queen today is in charge of the Knights of the Garter, and here she is wearing the symbol of the Knights of the Garter on her. And this was created by Edward III, so you can see how long these knights have been going around in this knight club, this knight group. And the idea behind the Knights of the Garter was that it was trying to make the knights be good and honourable, to work together, to look after women and the poor and the needy and the old. And so during the reign of Edward, he not only made sure that the knights under his control were, being as good as they possibly could be, but he also made lots of new knights. He didn't mind sharing out power. In fact, he made 6 new knights on one day, just, which was unheard of at the time. Usually you had a few lords in the country, as few as possible, really, so you didn't have to share out your money too much. And then you'd have a good number of knights, but not too many. Again, you don't want loads of people swanning around with all the power. Edward seems to have thought differently. He seems to think that actually, let's spread things out a bit. Let's make a lot of people rich. And he treated his own children like this too. He had a few children, 5 sons, I believe, and he treated them all the same. He made sure they all had power and land and money. And unlike a lot of our medieval kings, his children never fought against him, because they were happy with him. There you go. Let's check out the chat here. Let's see what's yeah, okay, so people are liking this guy. Yeah. Now this is a good question here from Ahmed. do the people like Edward III? Yes, he's one of the few people that we have, the few kings that we have, where at the time people were really happy with him, as far as we know. Yeah, it seems like, most of the kings, we have barons complaining. We have, if not full civil war, it's like it's leading to civil war. During the time of Edward, the people of England are pretty happy with him. Now, I'm sure there are some people who don't like his policy on onions or something. No one's ever loved by everyone, but he's unusual in medieval kings insofar as there aren't loads of people trying to kill him all the time, at least not English people. Yeah, they seem to be quite content with him. And I think that's because he does seem to be quite a generous person. He's not a complete softy, as we'll see. He's definitely a warlord. But he wants to hand out that power, and he likes this idea of chivalry, of being a gentleman, riding around on your horse, protecting the damsels in distress and fighting the dragons and all this kind of stuff. So that makes him quite popular. Now, another thing that makes him quite popular is that he really is quite forthright. He wants England to be this amazing place. Yeah, he has a dream. He has an ideology of an England that is powerful and strong and independent as well. Which is something that, especially if we think of the early Norman kings, they didn't really like England very much. They liked it because it gave them money, but they didn't really like it for itself. Yeah, they didn't really care about the English people necessarily. Edward does. Edward wants to make England a country to be proud of. Um, Serena's saying by this time she would have already gone to America, or he would have. You already gone to America. Unfortunately, no one knew that America existed at this point. This is a world before America, long before America has been discovered. So yes, no one was going to America. You're stuck in England at this point. In fact, pretty much as far as you could go west would have been Ireland. That would have been like, whoa, crazy far. Queen Margaret saying at the moment you like him. Yes. Yeah, sometimes they go bad, these kings, don't they? We'll see. So, because Edward II was quite weak and quite unpopular, by the time Edward III comes to the throne, he's got a lot of problems. He's got problems with the people of England being unhappy with his dad, so he's got to prove to them that he's going to be a good guy. France is openly angry with England because, Edward's wife has been snubbed, Edward III's mum, so he's got issues with France going on. Scotland, yes, they've signed the peace treaty, but Scotland is still pretty scary, to be honest, because, they've got armies up there and they've got a grudge to settle, so they might come down. And so Edward is beset by enemies on all sides. Let me just, I'm being told that my screen is freezing. Let me see if I can fix that for people. Now, it may be that if I am freezing on your screen, it might just be your settings that need a little bit of a mix-up. I don't know. It's hard for me to tell because it seems like it all works on my end. So yeah, he's surrounded by enemies. He's got the Scots to the north. He's got the French to the south. He manages to keep his own people relatively happy. Partly through having knights and garters and a more equal parliament and giving people money and looking after the people. But his real problem comes when France and Scotland, they decide to sign an alliance with each other. So France and Scotland, they come to this agreement that if one of them is ever attacked, the other one will come to their aid. Now, for England, that's particularly scary because, of course, in England, you have Scotland to the north, France to the south, which means that if Edward ever does want to go and fight the French, in the south, the Scottish will attack from the north and he'll be caught in a sandwich. Likewise, if he ever decides to go north and fight the Scottish, then he's going to be attacked by the French from the south in a sandwich. Leaves him in a really, really quite a worrying and scary position for poor old Edward. But that's not the worst of his problems. We'll come back to that in a minute, because during King Edward's reign, we are hit by a Black Death. A plague spreads across Europe and across the lands. Now, plagues had happened before. In fact, a really serious plague a bit earlier in history under Edward II. So plagues weren't necessarily new, but the Black Death was particularly savage. Now, let me just find my dates for the Black Death. Where are we? In Britain, when was the worst year? Let's see. Okay. Now, it spreads. So we're looking at, I'm trying to find the worst year for England here, because of course it happens all over the world. I'll come back to that in a second. But the Black Death, it starts to spread. It's a terrible mixture of plagues. It spreads probably from China or somewhere over there in Asia. It's brought into Europe, ends up hitting Italy. Merchants from Italy then bring that because they're trading goods, textiles, silks and things. And it comes to England. Now, when it comes to England, this disease will ravage the population quite mercilessly. About a third of the population of Europe will die, which is, millions of people. It's far worse than our current coronavirus for sure, and it's a disease that kills you in quite a grim way. You get horrible, great big boils, and you get horrible patches on your skin, and you get very, very painful swellings, and then you die. Yeah, so it's a really, really disgusting disease. It's called the Black Death, partly because of the black blotches that it leaves on you as the blood under the skin starts to coagulate and look all dark. It's spread by rats and fleas, the fleas on the rats. Yes, well, who was it? Was it Hemingway who said that history doesn't repeat itself, but it very often rhymes? So yes, maybe not a complete repetition of history here, but maybe we're seeing a bit of rhyming at the moment. But the Black Death, is far worse than the coronavirus, mainly because back then the doctors don't really know what to do. You don't have very many good doctors anyway, and science isn't quite where it is today. For instance, they have no idea that it is rats that are spreading the plague. In fact, most people will say that it's God, because he's angry at people because they've been too naughty. Or maybe it's the Jewish people again. Remember, the Jews have been chucked out of England? Well, they can still be blamed for stuff. So all across Europe, Jewish people will be beaten up and sent away or killed because they're believed to have brought the plague. They didn't. It was fleas on rats. But of course, at this point in history, nobody's ever used a microscope. They don't exist. Nobody's ever... no one knows what a germ is. The best scientists at this point in history will tell you that illness is caused by bad smells. If you smell things and they smell terrible, you might get sick. And that's about as scientific as it gets. You've got some people saying it's the planets moving through the sky that's causing the disease. You've got people trying to cure the disease by doing all kinds of weird things, lighting giant candles, whipping themselves to cause themselves pain, to try and make God believe that they are sorry for whatever they may have done, which caused the plague. You've got people chopping chickens in half and rubbing them on their boils and things. So it's a bad time for England. A lot of people are dying, and the real repercussions of this will be seen a little bit more in future, at least the social repercussions. But considering that the people of England are going through one of the most distressing diseases and terrible times in history, and they're still happy with their king, that tells us that he must be doing something right. Because usually when disasters strike, people will go and they will complain at their kings, or they'll get rid of their kings, they'll blame their kings for it. Edward, he's not blamed. He is still supported and liked by the people. So there you go. So he's got that to deal with, but that's not why I like Edward the best. No, what I like about Edward is that he's got Scotland to the north. He's got France to the south. They've signed this deadly alliance, promising that they will help each other out. Now, most kings, most people, would look at that alliance and say, "Ooh, that's a bit scary. I better stay on my best behavior." Not Edward III. Edward III decides that if people are going to gang up on him, then he's going on the offensive. Ooh. Laura, sorry, Lauren, that you are offended by the chicken. That's medicine for you. Um, so what he does is he decides to call himself King of France. He has a whole ceremony and everything. He says, I am now King of France and England, double king. Oh yeah. Now, as you can imagine, the actual King of France isn't particularly happy with this. No, he says. No. Because he's already the King of France, and he doesn't like the idea that now Edward's saying he's the King of France. And so, well, there's going to start a war. Now, Edward, he's ready, though. He gets a massive army ready to attack France. He also gets a massive army to go send up to the north of England to defend against the Scots, because, of course, he knows they're going to attack, but he's not scared. He's going for it. Who is his wife? His wife is Queen Philippa. That's his wife. Now, it might seem a bit strange and a bit arrogant for Edward just to call himself King of France, of course, but we have to remember that Edward's own mum was a princess of France, Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife. He speaks French. He's got, part of England is still in the French lands, so what we call France today. So it's not a completely weird idea to decide that you're going to be King of France. His grandfather was King of France. So it makes sense, really, but not to the current King of France. He is not happy with this. And of course, war must begin. Oh, people are speaking French in the chat. I wish I understood what you were saying. Ooh. So, Edward will start a war that goes down in history as the 100 Years' War, which, as the title suggests, is an incredibly long war. It's called the 100 Years' War. It actually lasts for 116 years, so it's even worse than 100 years. As you can imagine, Edward may start this war. He's not going to be alive to see it end. In fact, our next few kings that we will see will all be kings during the 100 Years' War, because it's such a long war. Yeah. So this war will see Richard II. We'll see Henry V and Henry VI. And Henry IV. They will all be kings during the 100 Years' War. So Edward started something pretty impressive here. And to be honest, as this war starts, Edward does pretty good job. His armies will go down to France and they will have major battles. He defeats the French first at sea in the Channel. He sends his boats out and he defeats the French navy so that they cannot block his passage to France from England. He then has two incredible victories at Poitiers and at Crécy. Here we can see a picture of King Edward. Here he is after the Battle of Crécy, down in France. Here he is with his lion-shaped armor on, with his crown on top, and he's counting the dead French. You can see his counting finger: 1, 2, 3, or I suppose 1, 2, 3, because he speaks French. He's counting the dead and going, "Oh yes, done quite well there. Wonderful, great, keep it up, chaps." But it's not necessarily Edward himself who is fighting. He's a bit of a warlord. He looks up to his granddad, Edward I, Hammer of the Scots and all that. But really, the man on the ground, the hero of the day, the finest of knights of England, is his son, another guy called Edward. Edward of Woodstock, old Woody himself. But we don't know him as Edward of Woodstock. I mean, that's his proper name, of course, but the way that we remember him is as the Black Prince. Ooh, the Black Prince. Now, legend says, if I can get my picture to behave itself, legend says that Edward of Woodstock is called the Black Prince, or Le Prince Noir, because of course it's French. He's called the Black Prince because his armor was black. His helmet was black. His horse, black. His horse's clothes, completely black. I mean, I think you get where this is going. His sword, lacquered black. And his shield, black, with 3 bright white ostrich feathers on it. And he called his shield the Shield of Peace, because when you saw him coming, all in his black armor with his 3 white ostrich feathers of peace, you better get peaceful, otherwise he's going to smack you in the face with his shield of peace, and that'll be the end of you. Why is everything black? Why? Because this is a knight with style. Oh yes, the Black Prince. Now, uh, we're not entirely sure, to be fair, if he was quite as black as everyone says. It was, he started to really be called the Black Prince about 30 years after he died, and that's when the descriptions of him all in black started coming out. In reality, he might have just been quite a normally armoured prince, and they might have called him the Black Prince because, like the Black Death, he was so deadly. Deadly, deadly! Oh dear. The Black Prince was the scourge of the start of the Hundred Years' War. Who defeated the French at Poitiers? The Black Prince. Who defeated the French at Crécy? The Black Prince, because he was probably the best general, the best fighter that England had had. Um, Good question, Jay. Where did he get an ostrich? Now, I believe that the ostrich feathers were painted onto his shield with white paint. But at this point, yes, they would have known ostriches. I assume his, let me think, great-grandfather, Henry III, if you remember, he had that zoo going on, that menagerie. I assume he had an ostrich or two. So, yes, people would have known about the ostrich for sure. And of course, we must remember that these medieval kings, they've all been down to the Holy Land, fighting in the Middle East and in North Africa. So they would have seen plenty of ostriches there, brought up from further south. So yeah, good question. But yes, people would have been very, very aware of ostriches, even if you wouldn't necessarily have seen them in the wild in England, of course, or Europe. Um, oh, that's a good question, Queen Margaret. I'm not sure if Edward does have any animals. Not as far as I know. He may do, but it's not something that I've looked into about him. Maybe that's something to research. Did Edward III have any pets? I like to think that he had, I don't know, maybe a dog that he dressed up as a knight. I can imagine that. That's the kind of thing he'd do. Yeah. Um, uh, Now, I'm not sure exactly who the king on the ground is. That's a good question. But the Black Prince does manage to defeat much of the nobility of France. Um, uh, I'm not, as I said, I've said previously, I'm not very up on my line of French kings, not so well as I am on my English kings. But during the Hundred Years' War, there will be several kings that come and go in France as they are defeated one after the other. But so at this point, we're looking at the high point for England. The French are being defeated left, right, and centre, and England is growing. At the same time as Edward the Black Prince is fighting down in France, taking land after land, castle after castle, city after city, Edward's other armies are in the north of England, keeping the Scots back. You know, the Scots cannot follow their agreement with France to defend France if they're ever attacked, because they're being kept busy up in the north by Edward's other armies. He is so black. um, Now, if you ever want to, you can go and see. The Black Prince is buried in Canterbury Cathedral down in Kent. So if you ever get the chance, you can go down to Canterbury and you can see the tomb of the Black Prince, which has a wonderful epithet on it. Let me see if I can read you his epithet. Let me find you the... let's see, I'm sure I can find it here somewhere. Now, an epithet is... sorry, an epitaph, not an epithet. An epitaph is something that you write on a tombstone to remember people by. And Edward has a particularly good one, so I'll see if I can find a version of it here that I can read to you. Yes, this is what it says on his tombstone, which tells us a lot about him. We'll come to how he dies in a minute. But this is what it says on his tombstone. It says, "Such as thou art, sometime was I. Such as I am, such shalt thou be. I thought little on the hour of death, so long as I enjoyed breath. On earth I had great riches, land, houses, great treasure, horses, money, and gold. But now a wretched captive am I, deep in the ground, lo, here I lie. My beauty great is all quite gone, my flesh is wasted to the bone." Now, Danny, they do have his armor. That's a good question. Yes, in Canterbury, I believe in the cathedral, they keep his armor, or maybe in the museum nearby. His armor looks very brown now, though. It's all pretty much brown. He would be called the Brown Knight. I don't know if that's from aging, or maybe, it just wasn't that black to begin with. But his epitaph there on his tomb tells us that he was very noble, very very bold and brave and handsome. You know, he's a proper knight. You know, he would uh, travel around Europe, you know, defeating the armies of the French wherever they met him. And he was, of course, going to be the next king. He would have been Edward IV. But he doesn't get that far, unfortunately. The King of Spain, I believe he's called Pedro the Cruel, which gives you a bit of an idea about him. Although my line of Spanish kings aren't particularly good either, my knowledge of Spanish kings. But the King of Spain, after his victories in France, he asks the Black Prince if he would please visit Spain to help him defeat a rebellion against him. Now, I'm not quite sure the Black Prince should have done this, because the king's name was the Cruel, which meant that he probably wasn't a very nice guy, but still, the Black Prince, he comes down to try and help a fellow king, and he ends up getting ill. He ends up getting that terrible disease that kills so many kings, the disease of pooing yourself. Oh dear. Now, the Black Prince will suffer from dysentery on and off for about 10 years, and so he gets weaker and weaker, pooier and pooier, until one day he ends up pooing himself to death, like so many of his relatives before him. Oh dear. And that's the end of the Black Prince. But he does leave behind this amazing legacy, does the Black Prince. You know, he was always his dad's favourite, and of course Edward III is heartbroken when the Black Prince dies, knowing that the next king will not be him. It's very sad. But Edward, the Black Prince, had managed to secure loads of land in France. He'd managed to make England as strong and as powerful as his dad wanted, you know, as his dad had dreamed of. And all the time he did it by being a good knight, or so the story goes. He's not the kind of guy to run into a village and just start killing people. No, he's fighting people on the battlefield. He's attacking other knights and kings and leaders. So he gets a reputation of being very scary, hence the Black Knight bit, but maybe not to the common people. He seems to be well loved by the people of England in particular. Feared by the French, of course. You would not want to see, if you were fighting against an English army, and there at the front is a knight all in black, with his ostrich feathers on his shield. Ooh, I think you'd better get to running, because not many people... In fact, I don't think he was ever defeated in battle. No, he was defeated on the toilet, not in battle. There you go. Oh, the illness, Lewis, is dysentery. Yeah, at least that's what we assume these illnesses are. All these kings who poo themselves to death, it's dysentery that does it. Yeah, something like that. Yes. Oh, Josh is giving the Black Prince 5 stars. Well, that's very nice. I'm sure he'd appreciate that for sure. But if what I'll do is I'll just put his epitaph up here on the screen, so we can just look at that poem again, because it gives us a good idea of the man, but also the things that were concerns of people at the time, I guess. So let's unpick this and see if we can explain what's going on here. Oh, there we go. Make it a bit neater. Such as thou art, sometime was I. So basically, you are alive. I used to be alive too. I used to be like that. I remember that. It was good. Such as I am, i.e. dead, such shalt thou be. He's basically saying, look, I'm dead and you're going to be dead sometime too if you're reading this, which is true, of course, because everyone dies. I thought little of the hour of my death, so long as I enjoyed breath. So he's basically saying, look, whilst I was alive, I lived for the moment. I roamed the lands, I fought battles, and I didn't care about death. I wasn't scared. No. And on earth I had great riches, land, horses, great treasure, houses, great treasure, horses, money, and gold. So he's saying, look, I had all this cool stuff, but it gets a bit sadder at the end. But now a wretched captive am I, i.e. I'm trapped under the ground in my coffin. I can't get out because I'm dead. Yeah. Deep in the ground, lo, here I lie. So deep in the ground underneath my stone with this poem on it. My beauty great is all quite gone, which it would be after you've been dead for a while. My flesh is wasted to the bone. So it's a bit of a cautionary tale there. Maybe no matter how good your life is, you're always going to end up like the Black Prince. Such as I am, such shalt thou be. There you go. Quite poetic, our Black Prince. But he goes down in legend as a bit of a hero and also a gentleman, which would have made his father very proud, because Edward III now, but back to the king, he always wanted to be thought of as noble and kind. You know, he's firm, he starts wars, don't get me wrong. Um, but he's someone who also, he believes in justice and fairness. So he wouldn't just, kill people out of hand. And he certainly wouldn't torture people like that. He would forgive people. He was very he would show great clemency when his enemies were defeated. So if the French did surrender in the wars, he would set them free. He would send them, back to their castles most of the time, because a knight believed, and Edward very much believed, that if someone surrenders to you, you don't kill them. You treat them with respect. You might sell them back to their own side for a bit of money, that's okay. But you don't execute prisoners. No, a true knight always lets people have a second chance. And so this is what Edward's doing. He goes down in history as being, very fair. Still a dangerous guy. He's a king. Don't get me wrong. He's still from the line of our French kings here, so I'm sure he had a temper on him, like many of the others did. But what he's remembered for is being forgiving and kind, and relatively gentle, even though he's a warlord. Gentle warlord doesn't quite fit, does it? But there you go. Now, so his children, they go on to be, strong and powerful. His kingdom becomes humongous because he takes over a lot of France. Let me see if I can find a map just to show you how big his conquests are. Here we go. Here's a nice one. Oh, if I can find it. Oh, let me find that. Can I find a good one? Ooh. Here's a nice one. Okay. Now this tells us, this is going to poke us a little bit into the future here, but just to give you an idea of what Edward manages to achieve in France. Here we go. So this is before he starts to fight in France. This is before he declares war on the French and decides that he is the King of France. You'll see that we still have a little bit of Normandy up here, and we have Aquitaine, or part of Aquitaine, which would have been, the east part of Aquitaine, which would have come along with Eleanor of Aquitaine, of course, mother of Richard I and John, wife of Henry II. Now, what he does is he manages at the start of this 100-year war period to munch into France. We see this green area here now is England. He takes over all of Aquitaine, pushes far into the east. He also manages, or him and his predecessors they will also take the north. But you'll see that France will start taking land back, and eventually, at the end of the 100 Years' War, it's all gone terribly wrong for England, because the whole thing now is France. It kind of goes wrong for sure. But we'll talk about that and exactly what goes wrong when we come to the respective kings. But a little spoiler here. It's all to do with a peasant girl, French peasant girl. She'll fight back for the French, and she'll end up conquering the English, or at least helping out with the conquering of England. So very good. Yes, you've got it, Joshua. Yeah. So, but we'll come to her and the English kings a little bit later, because that's the end of the 100 Years' War. This is the beginning. This is when things are going good. The English are in France, and they are conquering land after land, city after city, making a real mess of the place. So, Edward, he dies. Unlike a lot of them, he ends up dying in quite a peaceful way. It's not a pain-free way, but by the time he dies, he's 64, so he's quite old. Now, his victories in France do start to slow down. When he's a young man, when his son is still alive, the Black Prince is still alive, they do some amazing things, conquering, defeating parts of, and taking down parts of France. Um, but when the Black Prince dies, young, Edward starts to, get old himself. He starts to slow down, and his victories come less and less frequently. In fact, the French start to push back a little bit and take bits of land here and there. Um, and to be honest, he kind of runs out of energy because his health starts to deteriorate. He doesn't keep as young and fit as he was. There's a good question there. What sports did they play? Let's think. At this time in history, I don't know. There would have been lots of, especially with Edward III, there'd have been lots of tournaments. So we're talking lots of jousting and combat sports. There'd have been a lot of hunting. That's what the nobles would have done for pleasure. I'm not sure if things like tennis have come along yet. And football wouldn't have been created quite yet either. Not long. We're getting towards the time when these games would be played. I assume there would be things being played, ball games, but maybe not quite so official as, to have official names yet. Although I'm not much of a sport historian. So I'm guessing the sports that Edward would have taken part in would have been things like sword fighting, fencing, wrestling, hunting, maybe racing and jousting, things like that. The kind of things we can imagine knights doing. Archery competitions, that would have been quite popular as well, I imagine. How many battles did he win? I don't know. At least 3 important ones. But during this period, there were a lot of battles going on, and he's winning more than he's losing. At least when he's young, for sure. Good question, though. I'm sure you'll be able to look up and find somewhere exactly how many battles. Yeah. That's a good question from Kyle. Why would you name your son your own name? And of course, yes, Edward I named his son Edward. Edward II named his son Edward. And then Edward III named his son Edward as well. And I suppose it's just to keep that line of succession going. I suppose if you are a famous Edward, you might want your son to be, thought of the same way as you. You might not want your name to die with you. We see this a lot throughout the world. In this country, the most popular king names are Edward and Henry. We've had 8 of each of those. We've had quite a few Williams and Georges too. In France, of course, they had a lot of Louis. A lot of Louis. So yeah, there are some names that go down in history as just, people like to give other people their name. Yes, okay. So he ends up, he runs out of steam towards the end of his life. He's still well respected by his people, but the victories aren't really coming quite as fast. He's going to have to leave that to the next kings in line. And he dies a fairly peaceful death. He gets old, his health deteriorates, and he ends up dying possibly of a stroke, although we can't be sure because trying to figure out, historical illnesses and deaths is difficult. But yes, he dies what they would say at the time. He dies of old age, peaceful in his bed in England. He never officially becomes King of France, even though he calls himself it. He never truly defeats the French, so he can't honestly say he is King of France, but I like to think he definitely made himself a French flag and a French crown and wore 2 crowns at once. I don't know if that's true, but I like to imagine it is. Yeah, here you are. So, yes, next week we will look at the next 2 kings in line who will continue on the 100 Years' War. Hopefully you like Edward III as much as I do. Like I say, he's one of my favourites. He seems to be a genuinely good guy, or at least, a king that we can be proud of. Yeah, some of the others, maybe not so much, but yeah, I do like Edward. Now, tomorrow we'll be going to France, so we'll look at the geography of France, which is good because that ties nicely with the 100 Years' War. And yes, then we'll be off to Rome for the end of the week for Wednesday and Friday. Thank you very much, guys. Have a wonderful day, and yeah, stay happy.